Russia has made its fastest gains since the first weeks of the war amid claims it has mustered a record force of over 500,000 men as it launches what appears to be the first stage of its summer offensive.
Kharkiv again, and this is the scene of the action. We're in Kharkiv again.
My name is Jerome Starkey, defence editor at the Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. Russia's President Vladimir Putin is in China meeting Xi Jinping, and a European leader has been gunned down in the streets. Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico is fighting for his life after being shot in the stomach. But we're going to start today with the reports from Ukraine of the Kharkiv offensive on the northeastern front. Russian forces have advanced at least 5 miles into Ukrainian territory over the space of a week. That is unusually fast. This has been a war of slogging, grinding offensives at the cost of huge numbers in terms of men and materiel. But this offensive has made fast gains for Russia. It's interesting, it does not appear that Russia is attempting to capture Ukraine's second largest city, the city of Kharkiv, but it has made these incursions into rural Kharkiv province, starting last Friday with an attack on the large town city, it's called in Ukraine, of Vovchansk, home initially to some 18,000 people, only about 300 residents left as it is reduced to rubble by this onslaught. The Institute for the Study of War has suggested that Russia's ambition appears to be to create a buffer zone. Territories of Kharkiv and Belgorod are adjoining the city. The edge of the city of Kharkiv is only 15 miles from the Russian border, and both sides have long been able to fire across that border at positions either side. Nonetheless, the Institute for Study of War suggesting Russia may be trying to push Ukraine's forces back. It would also appear that while this is not an attempt to take Kharkiv city, it is clearly an attempt to stretch and pin down Ukraine's already overstretched defenders, to draw reserves to this new front on the northeast of the line of contact, potentially drawing troops away from the Donbass, which appears to continue to be Russia's main effort around places like Bakhmut and now Chaziv Yar, around Avdiivka, both those towns which Russia captured over the course of the last year at huge cost, and where Russia continues to try and grind forward. Suggestions from the Rusi think tank that this is the opening stage of Russia's long-expected summer offensive, and we might also expect to see more skirmishing on the south-central front of Zaporizhia, possibly also in Kherson. But again, those fights likely to be attempts to pin down, draw and distract Ukraine's defenders to allow Russia to put more pressure on in the east in the Donbass. We've heard from General Kirilo Budanov, the head of Ukraine's GUR military intelligence, who said that they have no more reserves to commit. Slightly desperate situation in Ukraine. The National Security Council estimated that some 30,000 Russian troops are currently involved in this offensive, with another 50,000 sitting in reserve in Russian Belgorod province, threatening both Kharkiv and neighbouring Sumy, again keeping Ukraine's forces pinned down. President Zelensky has cancelled all foreign trips in order to be there, in order to monitor the situation across this Kharkiv offensive. But the suggestion more recently, in recent hours from Ukraine, is that the pace of that Russian advance has slowed. The front line is again stabilizing. Ukrainian forces, we understand, have fallen back to new positions. There are reports, unconfirmed reports I picked up this week, that perhaps this was an opportunist attack by Russia. Whilst Ukraine has long been tracking the build-up of Russian forces in Belgorod, perhaps long expected an attack in that area. Of course, the exact timing and exact location was still something of a surprise, and there's a suggestion that perhaps Russian forces may have seen a rotation or a gap in the front line in Ukrainian strength and exploited that. When they launched the attack, it came in force, whilst the troops were operating in small numbers, in small assault squads. They were backed by a massive bombardment of rockets and air-launched glide bombs. The first stage of the Russian attack came around Vovchansk. The second element, some 20 miles to the west, directly north of Kharkiv, around the town of Liptsi. Those positions appear to be, that offensive appears to be slowing down, but worth keeping an eye on that. And we will keep you updated on how that Russian offensive moves and whether or not it leads to any sort of secondary attacks further east in the Donbass. The other things we want to talk about today: Russia's President Putin's visit to China. Now, this is at least his third visit to China. And of course, since the war started, and of course, he went there just before invading Ukraine, when President Xi and Putin described a friendship with no limits. Now, there are two things I suspect Vladimir Putin is trying to get out of this relationship with China. The first is prestige. Vladimir Putin does not have many allies, and he certainly has no allies as powerful as President Xi. He is his most significant supporter, and the fact that Beijing is willing to welcome Vladimir Putin is a coup for Russia. It is symbolic, and the fact that Beijing is continuing to stand with Russia will give Moscow some succor as the rest of the world lines up against him and on the side of Ukraine. But more importantly, perhaps, than just the theatrics and the symbology of this visit is what it might mean in terms of material support for Russia's war. We know that Russia has ramped up its war economy in a really urgent, some might say desperate bid to resource its forces on the front line. And Russia has also been looking around the world, as Ukraine has, to see where it can source more, crucially, more ammunition. And from Iran, we've seen it trying to source and successfully sourcing those long-range kamikaze drones. Now, China, as far as I understand, has so far not provided weapons that will tip the balance. That's according to briefings from Western officials, but it has been providing parts and it has been providing some ammunition. That will be key to Vladimir Putin. He will be desperate to keep that tap turned on. Of course, Russia's other sources of ammunition have been North Korea and Iran. Its options are limited, but it is also ramping up its own domestic production to keep itself in the fight. Russia has lost a staggering 450,000 men, either killed or injured on the front line, thousands of tanks, various estimates putting the figure upwards of 3,000 tanks, many more armoured vehicles. But if there's one lesson from history, we know that Russia has proven itself able to absorb and endure spectacular losses and to continue fighting. But without bullets, without ammunition, then those forces on the front line will be vulnerable. And that vulnerability is something Ukraine has experienced. It is something Russia is trying to avoid. That is why Vladimir Putin is in Beijing. And we're going to come back now to the ongoing story of the assassination attempt of Prime Minister Robert Fico in Slovakia. He was gunned down in the town of Hanlova, northeast of the capital Bratislava, after finishing a government meeting, a government away day, and he was out and about on the streets, meeting the crowd, shaking hands, when somebody lunged forward with a pistol, we understand, and shot him repeatedly in the stomach. He was airlifted to hospital. He's still, as we record this, fighting for his life. Now, this is highly unusual, highly disturbing. There are echoes. The situation with most jeopardy, of course, are the echoes of the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, which led the world careering into World War I in 1914. This is different, but nonetheless a moment fraught with jeopardy because we still don't understand who, or rather the motivations. We don't understand the motivations of the would-be assassin. We still can't say whether or not Robert Fico is going to survive. There are some suggestions that the man who's been arrested had been a member of a pro-Russian group within Slovakia, which is surprising because Robert Fico was also an ardently pro-Russian prime minister. There's a lot there still to emerge. We'll have to wait for that picture to become more clear, and we will keep you updated on that, of course. If you're watching on YouTube and you have any questions, please do ask them in the comments below. We're continuing to get a fantastic response from you to these episodes, so please do keep making your comments and asking your questions. One of the questions from last week was how many forces does Russia have in Ukraine? It's a really timely question because, as I alluded to at the beginning, the suggestions Russia has now mustered a force of over 500,000 men. That figure comes from Dr. Jack Watling, a war expert at the London-based RUSI think tank. He made the point that the prospects for Ukraine at the moment are bleak and it needs to be able to muster more men. It needs to increase the size of its army. It, like Russia, has suffered very heavy losses over the course of the last 2+ years. And that need for more men was also echoed by General Sir Richard Barrons, who spoke to me on our sister show, The World at War. And I'd recommend you have a watch of that if you're interested in the situation in Ukraine. But the suggestion now, Russia has mustered some 510,000 soldiers who are involved in the invasion of Ukraine. That is significantly larger than the force it had on the first day of the war. But of course, on the first day of the war, Moscow was expecting its invasion to be over in a matter of days, if not weeks. And we are now many hundreds of days into this conflict, more than 2 years in, and it shows no sign of abating. General Sir Richard Barrons in that interview with World at War also suggesting that this would go into 2025, 2026, perhaps before Ukraine can start to roll back the Russian invasion. He said it's not a war that can be fought against the calendar, but it is a war in which Ukraine is going to need more men and more weapons and commitment from its allies to provide the weapons and the ability within Ukraine to raise the armed forces. Question number 2 is whether, given what we've seen of Russia's armed forces in Ukraine, indeed the sometimes rusty, shaky, surprisingly poor capability of those armed forces, are we confident that their nuclear forces are up to scratch? The short answer is we can't be certain, but we do know the world was surprised in many respects by the poor performance of Russia's armed forces. We continued to see sort of tactical, strategic failures on the battlefield, which it compensates for with scale. We have also seen Russia learning quickly on the battlefield and the evolution of technology on both sides, on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, in areas particularly like drones and electronic warfare. And Russia does have very sophisticated air defense weapons, and we've seen them working well for Russia in many instances during this campaign. That's not to say weapons haven't got through. Russia's nuclear forces are one of Moscow's strategic, if not Moscow's strategic top priority. So we would have to assume, I would suggest, that its nuclear forces are in good working order. It would be rash and foolhardy to make a calculation on the fact that Russia's nukes would not work. This is on the back, of course, of Putin launching those non-strategic nuclear drills. A few of you asking why I was using the phrase non-strategic rather than tactical, and was that scaremongering? No, it's not scaremongering. Non-strategic was the term that Russia's Ministry of Defense used to describe those drills, which it announced on the back of suggestions from France and Britain, or a former British minister, that troops should be sent to Ukraine, Western troops should be sent to Ukraine, and in response to Britain's Foreign Secretary endorsing strikes with Western weapons into Ukraine. Now, Russia announced what it called non-strategic drills. Those are, we understand, drills with tactical nuclear weapons, smaller yield than strategic. But also, at the Victory Day parade in Moscow, Vladimir Putin made the point that his strategic forces, the intercontinental ballistic missiles which can annihilate cities and countries, that they are combat ready. So both types of nuclear weapons have been mentioned in the Russian saber rattling. And my final question that I'm going to answer today is, are there any weapons which can turn the tide in the war? It's a good question because we've seen Ukraine focusing over the course of this war on specific weapons. It closed the skies at the beginning. They wanted the air defense weapons. Those have been vital for protecting cities, protecting civilians, and protecting high-value military assets throughout the course of the war, but Ukraine needs more of them. They have, in some sense, helped Ukraine halt the tide, but they haven't turned it. We saw Ukraine demanding tanks, and that blockage, that was effectively unblocked when Britain sent the Challengers, then Germany and allies sent the Leopards, and America sent the Abrams. But they have not turned the tide either. Indeed, the American Abrams have been pulled off the front line. And now, of course, Ukraine is waiting for the F-16s, the American-made F-16 jets, which are going to come from the Netherlands and Denmark, which it hopes will turn the tide. But I have to say, the experts I've spoken to have said it is unlikely to. F-16s are unlikely to turn the tide. They will help. There'll be a morale boost. General Sir Richard Barrons, I asked him this exact question in World at War. And again, if you're interested, I'd highly recommend you watch it. He said it is always unwise to look for a silver bullet. What Ukraine needs is it needs enough men, enough equipment, enough training, and enough ammunition to sustain well-trained men, well-equipped men and women in the fight for long enough to not only to halt Russia's advances, but ultimately to roll them back. There does not appear to be one single weapon that will turn the tide. And indeed, that was also the message of the previous Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces, General Valery Zaluzhny, who said at the end of last year both sides were more or less technologically matched, and that he did not expect what he called a beautiful breakthrough on the front lines. That's all we've got time for this week. As ever, thank you for your questions. If you've got them and you're watching on YouTube, please make them in the comments below, and we'll do our best to answer them next week.